second of three lectures then on Durkheim's suicide. The last lecture covered the first section of the book, the first book of the book, that dealt with psychological or mental illness as a cause of suicide, and of what he calls cosmic factors as a potential cause of suicide. Variations in temperature, length of the day, season of the year, and that kind of thing. In the end, Durkheim rules all of those out and winds up using this data that negated those arguments to lay the foundation for a sociological theory of suicide that he develops now in the second book. So like in most of Durkheim's books, the first book is essentially a ground clearing, and then the second book then is when he develops his positive theory. So that's what we're going to be looking at now. I think what we're going to do, we're going to use some handwritten notes I have. I've shared these with students before. They seem to help. So again, on page 146, Durkheim argues right at the beginning of book 2 that we're analyzing the suicides of the sane, not the suicides of the insane, right? So why would people who are not insane self-destroy, right? That's sort of his basic question. He's interested in the causes of suicide, not really the different shapes or forms that suicide can take, even though we're going to find out in chapter 6 that he actually does. He's quite interested in that, right? Page 147, individuals are sane, but are pushed by a more or less insane society, or at least a society whose logic, whose sanity, whose reason is at the level of the society itself and not at the level of the individual. So an individual is pushed by this force that isn't necessarily or often in their best interest. It's in the social interest, right? So they're pushed by society to self-destroy. That therefore suicide is always a social death, right? So it's a voluntary death, but it's involuntarily caused by the possession of social forces. So again, you're an individual, you have a consciousness, society grabs hold of you, structures your unconscious, right? And then the consciousness that remains can lead you to self-destruction. So Durkheim, societies build people with a psychic structure, again, the social unconscious, and then subject them to social forces that possess them, sort of like a demon. And, in Durkheim's great book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he follows Feuerbach and others who argue that we in society often misrecognize the direct forces of the social as something like demonic or spiritual forces, right? We tend to have a magic or spiritual reading of social forces. Durkheim is trying to sort of de-fetishize society itself, de-fetishize gods and spirits to see that the things that push us, that compel us, the structures that are out of mind yet nevertheless determinate of our behavior come from society, not from gods or demons. Okay, so again, I think what I'd like to do, let's look on page 213. This is one of Durkheim's clearest statements of his sort of homo duplex model of human beings. In other words, as has often been said, man is double. That is because social man superimposes himself upon physical man. Social man necessarily presupposes a society which he expresses and serves. So in Durkheim's book, The Division of Labor in Society, distinguishes between the individual consciousness and the collective consciousness, the individual consciousness being that which essentially operates the human individual. It is the consciousness of sensation. It's the consciousness of sort of individual drives and action. And then the collective consciousness is sort of the realm of values, of rituals, of totem and taboo in Freud's terms and so on, right? Social roles, social faces, those kinds of things, to use all the terms they've been using. So, so there it is. Social man is the essence of civilized man. He is the masterpiece of existence. And therefore, that's what compels us. If you lose that, he says, we basically lose life itself. If life is not worth the trouble of being lived, everything becomes a pretext to rid ourselves of it. So if we become detached from society, that can be a cause of suicide itself. But this is the homo duplex model of the human being, right? The human being in society, the human being as social subject. Again, Durkheim uses this framing, this phrasing even in the rules of sociological method, the division of labor in society, and to a degree in elementary forms, and then here as well. So we have then the Homo duplex, right? And man the double. And so we are an individual self, as he says, a kind of physical self, a body, private thoughts, private desires, that kind of thing. And then a social self, social roles. So, like, Goffman is a Durkheimian theorist in that sense, totems, collective consciousness, all these kinds of things. So, egoism then refers to the energy cathected or embedded in the individual self. Altruism is the energy cathected or embedded in the social or collective self, the social self, right, on top. Traditional society, as Durkheim argues in his book, The Division of Labor and Society, is bonded together mechanically. This means that there is a really strong collective consciousness and a weak individual consciousness. In other words, traditional societies, villages, clans, tribes, are very altruistic. There isn't much of the individual self separate from the social self. Modern societies, however, modern capitalism, are bonded together with what he calls organic solidarity in the book The Division of Labor, which means we have relatively strong and dominant individual consciousness and a relatively weak collective consciousness, right? And hence, we're egoistic in that sense. So in the next two chapters, and in book 2 of Durkheim's Suicide, he's going to be outlining egoism as a structure of consciousness, basically. That there's a social unconscious, there are moral energy forces that push people, demand that people become more egoistic. And when you're in a society that is egoistic in that sense, you're not as integrated into society, and therefore you lack, you have insufficient society in you to sort of hold you into the world. You become identified with your own organ sac instead of with the social self. So again, so Durkheim is going to argue then that much of the causes of suicide in our time are due to egoism, and then in the fourth chapter, he's going to be outlining altruism as a form of suicide that was dominant in traditional society, but that still exists in ours. So at any rate, that's where we're headed here. Okay, so chapter 2, egoistic suicide. This is an excellent analysis. It's really it opens with his analysis of religion, right? So he has a discussion on page 152 to 170 of suicide in Protestant Europe, right? And we know that his data is pretty clean on this. That wherever Protestants are, right here. I mean, it's right on the first page, 152. That there's a much higher suicide rate in Protestant states than there is in Catholic or Greek Orthodox states, right? Much higher. And then whenever, even within a single territory, Catholics tend to have much higher rates of suicide than non-Catholics. So the Protestants are always more suicidal. I'm going to drop this down so that you can see it a little bit better again. Protestants are always more suicidal, right? So, so this is different rates of suicides per million people in different confessions or different religions. Jews always have the lowest, or almost always the lowest. Catholics are also low, and then Protestants are high, right? Are always the highest. Everywhere without exception, Protestants show far more suicides than other confessions, right? And then he says that the aptitudes for Jews for suicide is always less than that of Protestants. In a very general way, also less than that of Catholics. So why? So he's trying to explain. So he begins by trying to explain Jew, right? And again, the conscious religious beliefs are not really causal here. He's going to make this argument. So it isn't because Protestantism and Catholicism make a strong, especially Catholicism, right, make a really strong case against suicide, and that if you commit suicide, like in Dante's Inferno, right, that if you commit suicide, you're hellbound. And I was raised Catholic. Suicides in my rural Catholic church. I'm trying to think if this. I think suicides were not buried in consecrated ground, right? That you were had to be buried, I think, at the town cemetery instead of the Catholic cemetery. I'm not 100% certain on that, but that would be the tendency, right? That if you've committed suicide, you've committed a mortal sin. Therefore, by definition, you can't be bound for heaven, and therefore, again, used to be buried outside of the church, that kind of thing. And Durkheim's going to say that's not what's going on here. It isn't the belief. It isn't the conscious prohibition against suicide that matters. if that were the case, Jews would have the highest rate of suicide because they lack a kind of belief in this, right? So it's the unconscious structural forces that are determining the low rate of suicide among Jews and the high rate of suicide among Protestants rather than the conscious belief, right? Yeah, so again, the Christians prohibit suicide with great emphasis, penalize it with great severity. They teach that a new life begins on the other side of the tomb, where men are punished for their evil actions, just as much. So again, if you commit suicide, you're going to get punished in the next life. Now, this is not emphasized in Judaism, right? The Catholic, and then he's going to make some claims about this, that he's going to be looking at the idea of free thinking. So he's going to make an argument here that Protestants are, for one thing, Protestantism is a city-based religious movement, and it tends to be linked to capitalism and linked to relative modernity and linked to freedom of thought, and that Protestantism in general requires freedom of thought. He writes that the Catholic accepts his faith ready-made without scrutiny. He may not even submit it to historical examination. Since the original texts that serve as its basis are prescribed, you're not allowed. A whole hierarchical system of authority is devised. The Pope is infallible, those kinds of things, right? And with marvelous ingenuity to render tradition invariable. So, you don't make your faith in Catholicism. It is ready-made for you. And as a layperson, you essentially are taking, the religious teachings of the authorized of your authorized betters, the bishops, the Pope, and so on. You are a taker of an already finished faith rather than a maker of one, right? Whereas in Protestantism, you're far more the author of your faith. The Bible is put in your hands. No interpretation is imposed. The very structure of the Reformed cult stresses that state of religious individualism. You have to be able to read. You've got to be able to understand. You've got to be able to interpret, right? There's a strong emphasis upon, biblical exegesis, that kind of thing, right? And interpretation. All right. So he argues that the proclivity of Protestantism for suicide relates to the spirit of free inquiry that animates that religion. Again, this idea that you're not bound. Yeah. So Protestantism, as opposed to Catholicism, leaves much more to free inquiry, leaves much more to the individual, right? Concedes a greater freedom to individual thought than Catholicism does. Then he has a problem with Judaism, because in Judaism you wind up with really strong literacy, reading, interpretation, and so on, right? It's really strong among the Jewish population. But he claims that the reason that doesn't lead to a breakdown of integration is because you're not really developing an individualized interpretation. You're merely coming into possession of an already existing tradition. So Protestantism is open-ended. The inquiry leads where no one has gone before, whereas Judaic free inquiry is essentially reinterpreting what we already know, right? You must really be able to run one's mind over the same pathways and interpret. There's more to it than that, but that's his basic argument. So by the end of page 160, we get down to his claim that wherever you have high integration in society, you have a high solidarity, and that explains Judaic resistance to suicide. Is that you have a real integrated belief system and an integrated community about maintaining the ritual order of that belief system, and therefore you have a really solid society, mechanically bonded society that then resists because the individual identifies so strongly with the group that you're held bound. The ties that bind you to the group are strong, therefore you don't commit suicide on your own. All right, then he goes on and he talks about England. There's a really good section on England in here that I always like, page 161, where he makes the argument that England is largely conservative, right? He claims that of all of the countries of Europe, England winds up having a kind of Catholic-like or traditional-like rate of suicide. It looks like it doesn't look like Denmark. It looks much more like some of the Catholic parts of France. And his argument is that that's because much of England didn't really have a Protestant Reformation. They simply had the replacement of the Pope with the King. And, Anglicanism is essentially a Catholicism in English, right? Okay. Yeah. So religious, yeah, there he says it right. In England, Protestantism looks an awful lot like the Catholic Church. Okay, so it's about the same. Okay, so the Catholic Church then holds people bound and doesn't allow for much free inquiry or free exercise of thought. And yeah, okay. Then he's got these silly arguments here. Like I really have trouble with this. Jennifer Lehman was professor of sociology at University of Nebraska when I first arrived there in about 1990, and she had written two books, I think, on Durkheim and women. One of them with that title. There's a real problem with Durkheim's view of women. He makes this argument here. In all countries of the world, women commit suicide much less than men, and the reason he gives is that they are much less educated and fundamentally traditionalist by nature. They govern their conduct by fixed beliefs and have no great intellectual needs. Therefore, women are kind of traditional or primitive in some way and aren't subject to the same kind of egoistic forces that lead men to commit suicide. Now, there's an element of truth to this in the structure of 19th century bourgeois society, that women really were barred from the liberal professions. The only women who worked were working class women. There really weren't, to be a middle class person was to be capable of supporting a wife and family without work. So women, especially in the upper tiers of society, were unworking, and again the lower classes are out of this analysis to a large degree. Anyway, and so he thinks that's sort of important. So this goes on. So but by the time it's over, he gets to his basic argument that suicide is something that is inversely related to religious integration in a society. All right, then chapter 3 now. He moves on to marriage and family. So this is egoistic suicide continued. So he's continuing to look at data that reveals how modern society has a social unconscious that forces people to become self-ish to a degree, ego-ish, self-istic, right? That you really become heavily invested in the ego, in the I, in the self, and you become somewhat remote from and detached from the family and the other groups around you. And in many ways, this is why he claims women are, and that's what he's going to argue here, right? That women are insulated from egoistic suicide because they remained, at least in 19th century bourgeois Europe, they remained much more tied to traditional family roles. That it was men, especially among the middle classes and so on, who are out in a kind of egoistic way of self-determination and self-definition, and are facing the kind of negative consequences of that. Again, good, positive, and negative consequences, where women aren't. Okay, so now he goes into this, all these claims, looking at marriage statistics, and his big argument is that marriage tends to protect, right? That married persons commit fewer suicides, almost half, right, or about a third less suicides throughout Europe, right? It's really interesting, though, when you look at this, just how the rates of marriage were different than they are, at least different than what you would expect them to be. While at 30, unmarried men are slightly more numerous than married men. At 45 years, the former are only a slight minority. And so, yeah. So the idea. So what he finds is that marriage protects those who are married commit suicide. Less often, right? Married persons kill themselves in general less often than unmarried persons, and that nevertheless this proportion may be exceptionally reversed at certain ages. So then he goes into these kind of really interesting dynamics here. Yeah, here's my marriage statistics. I really like this graph right here on page 176. So hopefully you can make that. I'll drop it down and try to make it a little bit bigger again. Okay, I hope that's clear. Okay, suicides per 100,000 inhabitants of each sex or of like marital status and age, right? So this one's going to be really crucial. I really like this chart and explains a lot of the book. So what he finds is that so he's going to try to get married and unmarried people. So that's what this one here. So this number down here is sort of a summary. So he's going to say how much more frequent are suicides of married persons of the same sex and age, right? So the same sex and age. And look what he finds out. He finds out that for every group, right? For every group, though if it's over 1, if it's 1.0 or higher, that means that marriage protects from suicide, that the rates of suicide for married people of the same gender and age are lower, right? And that's true of every single category. And the maximum number is 37 for men above the age of 75. Look at that. If you're married, the rate of suicide is incredibly low, less than 10, it's 9 point something per 100,000. If you're not married, if you're widowed or single, you are 37 times more likely to kill yourself. I can't really say if any of my older friends have been in that category or not, but I can tell you my married older friends it's like they take care of themselves. They're embedded in a society, a domestic society of some kind, and whether it's the wife that takes care of them or whether they feel that they need to take care of themselves to make sure that that they're there to care for their wife, whatever it is, right? Or that their children are there and they have a reason for living because of that. They just take care of themselves better, right? So those deaths of despair that we saw in the previous video, the deaths due to suicide, to drug overdoses, and to liver disease, right, are lower because you're taking care of yourself a little bit better. But I've had unmarried older friends who just didn't do that, who drank relatively freely, a lot of fun to be around, but who just didn't take care of themselves as much. So even if you don't commit suicide, right, you can see that there's still going to be a different mentality. Okay, so all of these groups are the same, and what he's going to find is men. So marriage protects from suicide, and men get more protection than women do, right? And then you can see how it varies by age. Now, there's one group we've got a problem with, and it's this group right here. And it's young men. So young men 16 to 25 who are married commit suicide at roughly twice the rate. So that's why they have 0.5, twice the rate as unmarried. So this becomes something he's going to pay attention to. Why would it be that men are always protected when they're married from suicide unless they're very young? So what is going on with very young men? You could probably get this. He argues that, again, we're in 19th century Europe, Catholic France in particular here, right? And if you're young and married, you're young and married for life, right? And he actually makes this argument that the reason why you would get married is basically sexual interest. And then once married, you realize you're locked in for life and that some of the pleasures and joys aren't what you thought they were. And you're watching freedom vanish. So he winds up putting this group of young men, right? Men between 16 and 25 who are married. He uses them as one of the few examples of what he calls fatalistic suicide in a footnote later on, right? In other words, they're committing suicide, he claims, at a higher rate because they basically have an infinity of demands upon them and they realize that they're not able to stage something like their own self-determined desires, right? So marriage didn't turn out to be the pleasure that they wanted, which I think is kind of interesting. But for every other category person, there's a benefit to being married. And again, it's for men and women both, and men tend to get more help than women do, all right? All right, so how do you explain that? He goes on to explain that for a bunch of social reasons. Yeah, so there it is, by the way, page 178, where he says these too early marriages. You get married too early. It's an aggravating influence on suicide, that kind of thing. Okay, influence of the family. Yeah, there it is. Page 182 again, about those very young, very young married persons are more inclined to commit suicide than unmarried ones. This would not be so if their immunity were inherited. He says that's, again, it has to do with sort of the demands of marriage and so on. Okay. All right. So that's based. So conjugal society or marriage protects people, right? And then he has this really, okay, now there's a group, page 188. He claims that if you carve out women without children, married women without children actually commit suicide more often than unmarried women without children. So their marriage itself isn't protecting. So he's trying to make that claim. It's not the conjugal bond. It's not being legally married that matters. It's the fact that you're in a society that needs you or that you identify with in some way. That's what actually does it. Social solidarity and integration into a group. So if you're a childless woman, again, 19th century France, possibly left behind each day in a home without children around other people, you might be envious that you don't have any, that kind of thing. Again, I'm trying to think like Durkheim here, that you might have a higher rate. So again, marriage tends to protect, but not there. Yeah. Widowers tend to die before the widowed, which is kind of interesting too. Yeah, there it is, page 193. Men, conjugal society, so is disadvantageous for women in some ways, must even in the absence of children be admitted to be advantageous for men. Men benefit. Yeah, a woman takes care of them, they benefit, that kind of thing. Okay. All right. He finds that he has an analysis of domestic anomie, otherwise known as divorce, and family disruption, which tends to aggravate and be a cause of divorce. And in fact, he argues that, he actually argues that, we'll come back to this later when he gets to anomie. He just basically argues that that if he comes back to marriage, and he claims that in societies that have legal divorce or easy divorce, that it actually tends to lower the protection, because marriage becomes something that could dissolve, and because it could dissolve, it doesn't regulate to the same degree. So that it isn't as fatalistic as it was in parts of the world like Ireland or Catholic parts of Europe, where you weren't able to get divorced, right? Then being married was kind of like a complete lifetime commitment, and then and so if it's disrupted, it quite painful. Okay, all right. So page 208, you get the conclusions. We have thus successfully set up three propositions. Suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of religious society, varies inversely with the degree of integration of domestic society, and it varies inversely with the degree of integration of political society. So we didn't talk about that at all, right? So let's just put it that way. In times of war, suicides decrease. In times of the need of human labor in your political group, you commit suicide less, and you become more committed to, you identify more strongly. Patriotism, nationalism, that kind of thing tends to call forth people's identification, and integrates them into a group in a greater way. So there you get it. So so suicides, this is on page 202 to 216, the discussion of suicide in relation to war, nationalism, and political crises, and suicide declines with political, as in political integration increases. Again, page 208, there it is. Suicides vary inversely to social integration. And that's true of religious society, domestic society, and political society. Okay? All right. Then again, that discussion of homo duplex is on page 213. The idea of human, the doubled, the ego, the individual self, and then the collective consciousness and the altruistic self. That's going to be very important here, right, as we go forward. All right. Okay. I think we can set that aside. I think now as you go forward into altruism, let's just take a second here, because that's where we're going to make the move now into altruism. So I'm going to step back, give you a little bit of okay. So so psychoanalysts from Freud forward, view society as essentially the structures we saw in Totem and Taboo of language and law. It's a symbolic order of language and law. It's a system of language that allows for the naming of things, and it's a system of laws that allows for the norming of things, right? So names and norms, language, law, totem, taboo. Okay? All right, so altruism refers to selflessness, egolessness. When you're altruistic, you are all in it for the group, not for the self. There is something inside of one that is more than oneself, the symbolic mandate, right? So if you are installed within a society of totem and taboo, you identify with the totem. We saw that in those images of tribal society, right? That people who are in those societies in a totem identify with the totem. They overwrite themselves, right? They get little orifices cut in them where the spirit of the totem gets in them. They get a different name and so on, all right? So each person, now, again, within a totemic society, within any society of values, each structural position, each social role carries a symbolic mandate of rights, duties, obligations, and so on, right? That's the big other, again, of language and law. And then performing the duties and obligations of a social role, that's what altruism is. So altruism is being responsible towards the symbolic mandates. The norming and naming of society provides you with a position and a sort of mandate about what you should do. So the big question of the neurotic, what does the other want of me? The big question of Hegel's subject, what does the big other want of me? Again, and the answer is the symbolic mandate, right? The taboo, the things that thou must do or else, right? So performing the duties and obligations of a social role, that's altruism, which is really the behavior and action that's externally sourced. It's not coming from within, it's coming from without. And even if you're an individual, if you've been structured, if the unconscious structure of language and law has been effective, even when you believe yourself consciously to being acting in your individual interests, you're actually going to be accomplishing social ends. So again, if it works, right, the unconscious structure of language and law gets you to think you're doing things for yourself when you're actually sacrificing for the group, right? Okay. All right, so that's altruism. So it's a kind of a complicated thing here. All right, so page 217 forward, and Durkheim writes about altruistic suicide. So what's altruistic suicide? All right, so altruistic suicide occurs, this is kind of a silly drawing, but we'll use it. It's when the individual self is overridden and overmastered by the social self. When there's too little individual self to resist or to push back or to balance the demands of the altruistic social self. Okay, so yeah, so there's too little. The individual self is weakly developed. The ego is weakly developed. No energy is cathected or attached or embedded or invested in that self or that consciousness. And so you have this really, really strong collective consciousness of social self. I often tell my students, if you have two names, your first name is your ego name, and your second name is your family name. If you can think in terms of a totem, it would be a totemic name. If you would be willing to die to protect your family or your family's honor, that's altruism. If you instead don't care what happens to your family, but instead are looking out for your ego, that's egoism. So in general, altruistic suicide, right? Suicide due to altruism, suicide due to the crushing of the individual self by the social self, is the form of suicide that's characteristic of traditional society. Wherever you have really strong, powerful totems and taboos, collective consciousness, wherever you have mechanical solidarity, you're going to have a strong form of altruistic suicide. All right, so then he talks about like the sick, weak old men, wives with dead husbands, servants and followers of the death. Right? He's going to call that the suicide by duty, calm suicide. So you're going to talk about three forms or types of altruistic suicide. Suicide by duty. You must die. The big other speaks to you. What does the big other want of me? The big other wants me to die. And then you accept that with calm and reason, and not calm and reason, calm and a sense of rightness, and one dies. So the spirit double causes you to die, wants you to die, right? The social self says to the individual self, the physical self, die. And that's you must die. The spirit, I can't even read. Sometimes I can't read my own writing. So it's the suicide of the sick and the weak and the old who wander out into the snow to preserve food or something for the for the rest of the group, or where you get old and ill and can't contribute any longer and you wander away. In the book by Ladislaus Raymont, The Peasants, there's an example in there of old people, again, who sort of get past the ability to really be a functioning member of harvest season and so on. And they literally go away. They go away to some city to beg and then plan to die there, right? They often don't make it back, or if they do make it back, they literally come back on death's door and then die and then get buried in the village. But that's a suicidal act, the duty to reduce the burdens on your family by going out and dying, right? Wives with dead husbands who die, including the You know, the women who are forced, right? The death of got some images of that actually. Those who die because they're ordered to by hang on. Yeah, there we go. How many of these do I have? Yeah, so this is the wives or the widows who are forced to burn themselves, like parts of Hinduism have this, right? It was a practice in India and elsewhere. It's actually fairly widespread, including like in Viking societies, right, where you the master takes servants with them after death, including wives sometimes, right? So the woman, the widow, has an obligation to die, to burn herself to death, really, on the funeral pyre of her husband. In an era when these are not love matches, which they're not, think about what a self-sacrifice that is. You're not dying for someone you love as an individual, right? I don't love Harvey, my husband. Instead, you're dying because you're commanded to by the big other, right? It's really society itself that you're dying for, not really your husband. This isn't love. You're in this as an obligation, right? These aren't love matches. So here, yeah, burning a Hindu widow with the body of her husband. So there's the funeral pyre being built, there's the dead husband, and here she is being led on where she's going to die atop her. The British eventually outlawed this, and there was quite a. Here's another image of a widow jumping on her husband's pyre. I've got one more. This sort of depicts kind of the fantasy life or the belief system here. So the husband dies, you die along with the husband, and then you wind up again in, something like the afterlife, or in the cycle of rebirth, benefiting from having died with your husband. So you basically throw away your life here in exchange for an enhanced life in the afterlife, in the symbolic order. So people remember you as a good wife because you were willing to die. If you weren't willing to die, you'd probably be killed anyway. And even if you got away, you wouldn't be remembered well. So if you want to be remembered well, if you want to have a good position in the symbolic order, in the naming and norming structure of society, you have to die, right? Okay. All right, so what else do we have? So wives with dead husbands, servants follow the master to death. That's suicide by duty. All right, the second form of altruistic suicide is the suicide of mystic enthusiasm, which is really interesting when he writes about that, right? So again, the suicides by duty are here, like 219. Right there it is. Suicides of men on the threshold of old age, women on their husband's death, and suicides of followers or servants on the death of their chiefs, that kind of thing. It's your duty to die. All right, now the mystic forms. So here's the definition, again, just to get to this, is on page 211. Again, this isn't my normal copy of the book, but having given the name of egoism to the state of the ego living its own life and obeying itself alone, that of altruism adequately expresses the opposite state, where the ego is not its own property, where it is blended with something not itself, where the goal of conduct is exterior to itself, that is, in one of the groups in which it participates. So we call the suicide caused by intense altruism altruistic suicide. And then again, the suicide by duty, he's going to give a subtype to. It's obligatory altruistic suicide, suicide by duty. Okay? All right. So, and he claims, to a degree they all are, but that's the one that really sort of fits that. All right. Then he goes on and he talks about the social prestige. We're going to come back to that. Let's look at the one about mysticism. Here, I've got some images of these, but we'll come back. So suicide by mystic enthusiasm is the next one that he talks about. This is on page 225, where individuals strip themselves of, here, I tell you what, I'm going to use my handwritten notes, okay? So let's look at this. So obligatory suicide, you commit suicide, page 222, with calmness, compared to the other ones. So it's Yes, that's obligatory. The second form is what he calls non-obligatory or optional suicide. This is the suicide of social prestige or status. You make a trophy of yourself, of your physical being, of your individual self, to earn honor, to become honored in the naming and norming structure of society, in the totem and taboo structure, in the law, in the language and law of society, the law, the name, the language, right? You get honored, and you do it by again by honorific conduct. So he has all kinds of things. So let's say that you've been caught. He says that this is true of the military. There's a certain social prestige that's attached to suicide. This is so common in British detective fiction of the late 19th, early 20th century. A gentleman is caught in some illegal act and takes the gentleman's way out of committing suicide, thereby preserving family honor. Rather than having their name dragged through the mud in court, they commit suicide instead. Right? So that's this. Yeah. So it's not. So this is suicides that aren't required by society, but arise from a state of impersonality, altruism, as a moral characteristic of every man. Therefore, we should give him also the name altruistic, and optional is added to make their special quality clear. This word simply means that they are less expressly required by society than when strictly obligatory. All right, so there you go. So you don't have to do it, right? You don't have to do it. All right, and then you go on to the mystical one. Yeah. Killing oneself with the joy of sacrifice. And then India is the classic soil of this mystic form of suicide, right? Yeah. Yeah. And he goes on about this. Yeah, again, I wish I had my other copy of the book where I have all this stuff marked out better. Yeah, so, okay, the believer allowed himself to die of hunger. Among the bills, there was a rock on top of which men cast themselves with religious motives to devote themselves to Shiva. The story of fanatics who let themselves be crushed to death in throngs under the wheels of the idol juggernaut has become classic. Nothing is commoner, he says, than to see ships along the seashore filled with these fanatics who throw themselves into the water weighted with stones, or sink their ships and let themselves be gradually submerged while singing their idol's praises. Many of the spectators follow them with their eyes, lauding their valor to the skies and asking their blessings before they disappear. Right? So they're dying in order to achieve honor in the afterlife. As they die, they continuously call upon their gods, pray to them to accept the sacrifice of lives, and ask the same of the flames as the flames rise. They cast themselves headmost to the bottom of the abyss. The memory of these so-called martyrs is held with great reverence, right? So this is definitely an altruistic character. We see the individual, in these cases, stripped of personal being in order to be engulfed in something which he regards as his true essence, his social essence. The name he gives it is unimportant. He feels that it exists. So again, he's dying for. There's an imagination here, but it really is a social. It's a fully social form. So it's acute altruism. Right there, it is. Impersonality is here carried to its highest pitch. Its altruism is acute. But it's not that they often are dying because they actually feel that that this is happiness, right? It's dying because one is truly happy, right? Renouncing life, going to one's death happily, right? It is a good day to die. I go to my death happily, that kind of thing, right? Okay, so the three forms then: suicide of mystic enthusiasm. So that would be like people who die a religious death out of great pleasure. A couple images here. So here's an image of the juggernaut. So juggernaut was a real thing, right? The idol juggernaut. So it's this massive, movable icon pulled by a whole herd of men, essentially, who. And then what you would do is, as it's going by, to gain the applause of the crowd, you would sacrifice your body to earn this acclaim, right? And you're not doing it because you're unhappy. You're doing it out of a sense of mystic fulfillment. So there's the man who's just been ground under the wheels of the juggernaut, right? And that's a good way to die here, right? This is dying out of mystic enthusiasm, happiness, right? A desire to unite with the big other, to be completely overtaken by the social self, and even if it means losing one's individual life. Um, Here's some images of sacrificing babies to idols. This is the god Moloch. And so infants are taken up. So human sacrifice is clearly here a form of mystic altruism or enthusiastic altruism, right? Yeah, mystic enthusiasm. Here's another image of human sacrifice. So human sacrifice, especially if it's self-sacrifice. Now here's not quite self-sacrifice. The baby isn't saying, "Kill me, Moloch, eat me, burn me to death." Instead, it's the parents that are doing it. But it's that same idea of enthusiastic ending of life. You're not ending a life because you're unhappy. You're ending of life because of these mystic reasons. I'm going to save this back a little bit. Okay, we'll use that in the next section. So widows. So we saw how widows would burn themselves to death in some Hindu societies, but in many societies, even if you don't burn yourself to death, you still undergo a kind of social death. In many ways, not in many ways, it's exactly what mourning was. So, in Europe, a widow dressed in black was taken out of circulation, literally out of circulation, wasn't allowed to engage in social rites and social rituals, would essentially act as though dead for a certain period of time. Usually not for life, but for a certain period of time. So they'd wear black, they'd wear veils, their face would be veiled, and so on. I was in rural Italy about 7 years ago now. God, it's been a while. And I went to a cemetery that was just chock full of these Italian widows, these women dressed in black who, were going to Giuseppe's grave, to put fresh flowers out there and to pray for his soul in front of his grave. And that's the idea that if you're a good widow, you're out of circulation, not looking for another man, and you're essentially dead, and then using your life, what's left of it, right, to pray for your husband's well-being. So it's a lot like throwing yourself in the funeral pyre. You're not literally dead, but you're basically living to preserve the memory of your husband. So you're Mrs. Giuseppe for the rest of your life instead of something else, right? So period of mourning is important here. Here's an image. I think this is Aztec human sacrifice, right? These famous rites of ripping the heart out of the beating heart out of a subject. That's what this is. They've taken it out and blood drips and so on. Anyway, so that kind of blood sacrifice. This man just died for the group. In this case, it wasn't voluntary, and that must be a horrible thing to be captured by. To lose your life in such a way, to be captured, by soldiers, and to be hauled off to be ritually executed, so that your life is being sacrificed not for your God, but for somebody else's. Your life is being given up in mystic enthusiasm of other people, not your own. Must be an odd thing. So yeah, to actually have your life feed a strange God, and not your own. This is an interesting, and here's another, well, again, I'm not 100% certain. So, the Burning Man festival that occurs every year in the desert of Nevada is based on this druid myth of the Wicker Man. There's this really weird film I've seen about this. It's really weird. I don't recommend it. It stars Christopher Lee, but anyway, bizarre film. But there is apparently an element of truth to it, in that in Druid cultures there was a festival in which, I'm not sure if it was actually prisoners or those who committed sacrilege, or volunteers who were burned to death inside of the Wicker Man. So this is human sacrifice, again, feeding a god with human life. Again, if these were volunteers to die in such a way, it's mystic enthusiasm. if you've just been trapped and you're a slave. It's the mystic enthusiasm of something else. Your life is going to feed some other god, right? Okay, so those are the three forms then of altruistic suicide: mystic enthusiasm, the suicide of courage or optional suicide, right, where you make a trophy of your body in order to generate social honor, right? You die to get social honor. You die to get social honor. Okay. All right. Yeah, so an altruistic suicide then, a weak ego acts as though possessed by an impersonal force or spirit, right? Your mystic enthusiasm, you don't care about your individual self, you're willing to die. Demon possession is the traditional explanation of these kinds of suicides. Roman Catholic exorcism rituals are performed to remove demon and evil spirits that possess and animate the individual body. Martin Luther actually had this argument that those who commit suicide should not automatically be assumed to be headed to hell. He actually argued that those individuals, were driven by demons and spirits, and that we should have sympathy for them and not condemn them. And then certain contemporary churches have the same sort of belief that suicide is actually a demon or a spirit. Again, I grew up Roman Catholic, where suicide was really considered a deep mortal sin. And so anyway, so guilt is the spirit haunting of the small others and big other wrong. So the idea that if you're guilty, you must work on this. So so again, the suicide of mystic enthusiasm here is the individual kills himself purely for the joy of sacrifice. And in India, again, the highest bliss is self-destruction in nirvana. Religious suicide of mystical enthusiasm, drowning oneself, throwing oneself off a cliff, self-immolation, throwing oneself under the wheel of the juggernaut, jumping off ships, weighted with stones, while singing songs of praise, right? Starving oneself to death, self-suffocation. So again, the oversoul, the big other, the totem, completely captures the individual self, and then and drives one to death. So page 225, individual strips himself, personal being, to be engulfed in his social essence, true essence, social essence, maximizing impersonality, acute altruism. All right. So there we go. So that's the three forms then of altruistic suicide. So obligatory altruistic suicide, suicide is duty with a lot of calm, page 287, 283 and 4, and then 218 to 222. Optional altruistic suicide for prestige or honor is 222 to 223, and then his discussion of altruistic, mystical, acute suicide, religious reunification with the big spirit, or the big other, the absolute spirit, 223 to 227. Christian martyrs are talked about. The army is talked about as a realm of altruistic suicide. Yeah, then 228 to 240 goes into this long discussion of military suicides, and so he claims that those who are in the military are the military is sort of like the most altruistic, old, tight integrated society that we have, and that those who commit suicide in the military are often doing it for altruistic reasons, and that. He says because suicide rate in the military increases with the length of service and his time. B, suicide rates increase on page 233, increase for officers in career. So in other words, those who are enlisted or drafted. So if you're drafted, there it is. Suicide rate's higher for volunteers than drafted. So if you're drafted, you have a lower suicide rate than if you're enlisted. If you're an enlisted man, you have a lower suicide rate than if you're an officer or a career soldier. And then the suicide rate increases with length of service. So it's like the longer you're in, the more likely you are to die. And he claims that's due to altruism, right? And then elite troops have higher rates of suicide than sort of standard troops. Okay. All right, so there we go. So that ends our discussion of egoistic suicide and altruistic suicide. Suicide due to too little social self, or too much social self, right? One is typical of modern society, and one is typical of traditional society. I'll stop there, and we'll do another video in just a moment.